writing.
Good evening. Good evening. My name is Mchunzi Nawe. I'm from HSRC Press. I'm a publisher for the book, as one of those the books that I publish. I see some faces that are familiar. You are welcome, everybody, to this book launch. And I want to thank you for coming. The HSRC Press receives usually proposals, which, especially for this particular book, that would be coming to me as a commissioning editor. And then if I'm happy with it, it goes to the editorial board. The editorial board would discuss it and then say yes or no. And then you can then start writing. And then when the manuscript is finished, it goes to reviewers. So when the manuscripts get two yeses from two reviewers, then we can only publish. So this book went through that process, and both the reviewers unanimously loved the book, and then we said we'll go ahead and do it. So I'm so pleased that today we can say we can have a hard copy, and it was lovely to work with you.
Oh.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for that. My name is Desiree Lewis, and I'm going to be facilitating a conversation with the three editors, Tonita Mohammed, Paula Mochi, and Aika Swag. I think let's just give them a round of applause. That was Yeah, so I mean, I had the privilege of looking at the book a while ago, and I think for those of you just encountering it now, even a quick skim reveals how eclectic the contributions are, how dense, there are so many names, inclusive, and also not a lot of processes involved. So just to kick off with, could I ask the three editors, however you wish to respond, what the process, the origins, the evolution of this book was, because I think that in itself is just so different, even in the case of feminist anthologies.
Do you want to
You want to?
Okay. Hello everybody. And before I speak, could I get some of the contributors to put their hands up in the room, because we've got a few of them in the room. Who are you? Put your hands up. Yeah, stand up so we can see you. Sophie, Barbara, Carmita, Lorna. They've been very shy. I think there's a way in which we can trace this book. Oh my goodness, it's such a story. So we can trace it in a couple of ways, but we can also trace it through the African Feminisms Conference. And the African Feminisms Conference, which was started by Charlene Khan and Linda Spencer at Rhodes University in 2017. And the sort of community that space has produced, right? This gathering where it's non-hierarchical. There's professors and students. It's got its own ethics, its own ethos. It's a space of laughter, of tears, of dense theorizing, but also lots and lots of fun. And so I'll start this journey because after the 2017 and 18 editions, which were held at Rhodes, 2019 went to WITS, and at the end of WITS, the WITS conference, they said, who is going to put their hand up for the next one? And silly me, So no, but so then we had a UCT committee with a lot more colleagues. Barbara was also part of it. Nobusa Makubo, Mandi Sahanga, who's left, and through that, then AFEMS came to UCT, and then COVID happened, and so AFEMS did not come to UCT. Instead, we really all missed each other. We missed each other so much that we had a feminist circle, a digital feminist circle in the middle of COVID. And we invited Masilo Mate to do a feminist healing circle and reconnected with each other. And in 2021, when we could see each other again, these conversations happened. So the conversations are from a community that was unable to meet, that found each other again in a time where the world was upside down for so many of us. And through that, then we got funding that enabled us to record a lot of the sessions. And this is how the conversations came to be. And I suppose one of my co-editors can talk about then, after those conversations happened, how we decided to put the book together. Conita, can you speak to that?
No, okay. So, but also I think like we had a hybrid conference. So 2021 we did and I've been at every AFEMS, even virtually this year. So 2021 we had a hybrid conference, which was both very stressful, but also an opportunity because it gave us the opportunity to record the conversations. And once we had the conversations recorded and we transcribed it, we thought they were fantastic. Because what they allowed us to do was to see a collection of conversations together, and then to recognize that the conversations themselves were doing theoretical work. More often than not, I mean, I don't know if you all remember COVID and all those webinars and how exhausting they were. They were very, very tiring. But there was something about seeing the group of conversations together that allowed something really rich and dense and amazing to come together. Because usually when you're going to a conference, everybody's presenting a paper, it's very formulaic in some ways. But with the panel discussions that we had at the hybrid conference, it offered us a way to see people theorizing in conversation, in organic ways, and in ways that we could begin to recognize that people were mobilizing internal archives, that when they were speaking from a studied place in very many ways that you don't always recognize when people are in conversation, that the thoughts, the theorizations that one mobilizes in an emergent sense when you're in conversation with each other became very apparent. And so some of the ways in which we began to put the book together and think about the book was through the very sort of organic form of what it means when people are in conversation and theorizing as they're speaking, and yet doing so from a very personal, intimate space. And so, yeah, less about the process, I guess, but more about the
more about, and in a sense, what I'm trying to say is it's about a dialogic space. So we started to think about what is this dialogic space and how do we capture it, right? And how do we theorize this very idea of conversation, right? And so yes, that's the emergence of it. Aika's going to do the next.
No, I think you said it all. I think for me the flavor of the conference coming right out of COVID was that it was actually my first outing outside of my own house, where I had been, quarantined, and so the lockdown was lifted just recently. It was now, and so I was not the only one who had that experience of just having a surreal out-of-body experience, because suddenly there was community again, and there was face contact, and there was eye contact, and there was so these conversations that Kanita is that you're describing, I very much remember them as shocking, and I was overstimulated just by the experience of having more than 2-3 people in a room. So we valued that. I think we valued that, and for me personally, then there was this additional urge to hold on to it and to conserve it without trying to capture it. And then that's for me the process. I became a bit of an apprentice, I think, because I only joined AFEMS during that conference for the first time. And and then my process was definitely reading up on the literature that you hint at, this conferencing, theorizing about conferencing itself. And
so, as you speak, I'm thinking of a phrase that's used in the introduction, dialogic theorizing. And I think that really encapsulates what goes on in this book a lot of the time. But what I'm also struck by is, it's not as if you simply went back to AFEM's conversations and recorded them mechanically. Because there's a sense in which, and I'm thinking of contributors here like Coney, or the interview with Sophie, who's also here, are generically very different. And it's almost as if each contribution is doing something generically that's very, very innovative. So can you talk about that? How did these contributions, how do they stretch boundaries around what we identify as a genre, a form, a set form in anthologies, collections like this?
I think the literary theorists can talk about genres.
Oh my goodness, the literary theorists. Yeah. I suppose the way I'm going to try and maybe respond to that question, Desiree, might be to even take us back to even thinking what African feminisms is. Because if we think about how capacious this broad understanding of what binds us is, then I think we start to have a clearer sense of perhaps who we call into the community and what the community does for us. So if you don't mind, can I respond to your question in a weird way by reading the opening of the book? And then I think it will give us a sense. And I'm going to start with a quote that we opened the book with, which is a quote from Tony Stewart, the South African poet, at the 4th African Feminist Forum in Harare 2016. And we open with this quote: "The revolution is a woman, born into the light of feminist fires, standing in the fires of rage and love, burning tirelessly so her sisters will not die sad." And we start the collection with a question: who is the African feminist? Is it somebody located on the continent, a diasporic subject whose ancestors can trace their roots to the continent? Is it somebody who was racialized as black? Does it include the descendants of settler colonialists in places like South Africa and Zimbabwe? Is it somebody who identifies or self-identifies as feminist, womanist, motherist, stewardist, Afrofeminist, or all these other ways of naming our consciousness, right? What we really were trying to do was think about this polyvocality of our allegiances, right? To sort of affirm the diversity and multiplicity of the histories that are characteristic of African feminist communities, and that there is a necessity for sort of intentional communication, right? About the implications of being, in fact, formally oppressed, right? So that we came to this idea, this pluralistic understanding, expansive, inclusive conception of who this community is, right? And we grounded us in this shared concerns of feminized bodies in patriarchal societies. And I think maybe that might speak to the question of genre, because then it's not necessarily about, well, this is activist, this is creative practice, this is a literary scholar. It's just thinking about the solidarities, from queer solidarities, trans feminisms, to these, and sort of this pluralistic understanding that enabled us to really get away from the question of, the various genres or strands.
But there was a lot of also trying to make visible and and trying to honor the long sort of histories with varying kinds of thought and thinkers that we encounter in African feminist thought. So if I think of Coney and Norna's chapter around Elaine Solo and Benita's chapter, where the ways in which particular, African feminists come to animate us and enable a kind of traveling into community. So the Elaine Solo reading group, for example, that opens a particular space of community that we see people reading in this conversation, which is beautiful because we very rarely show our practices of reading. And in this particular chapter, with the Elaine Solo reading group, people are reading Fatima Manassi. And there's something really glorious about not just citing people towards an argument, but showing how engaging with somebody's thought enables a particular way of coming together, but also understanding our problems in a more organic way. And I think a lot of the conversations did that, where, for example, the conversation with Sophie Peters, who is in the room, that Charlene had with Sophie Peters. It's a conversation, but it's also a tracing and tracking of history, and a tracing and a tracking of a history that's lived in the present, and making a present towards thinking, how we move into the genealogies of the future through really honoring feminists who've moved us, whether it's through art or whether it's through thought. And I think a lot of the conversations center that. They center our own experiences, and we did something else. I'm talking a lot, you can stop me. But we did something else with these conversations that were transcribed. We provided introductions to them as well as conclusions. So every conversation has an introduction or conclusion that was written by someone who may not have been in the conversation itself to frame what the conversation does, and the work of theorizing it is actually doing some of us think it's doing. You may disagree with us, we would like that very much. And also ask people to make visible what we called, this was Puller's idea, citational maps. So very often when we're in conversation, we're thinking with particular thinkers, but we never mention them. And so people who had a dialogue were able to go back to their conversations and provide references, but not references, but rather that internal archive that does a particular kind of work for us. And so I think in that way it stretches genre, but it stretches the genre of the conversation, which we know, like Agenda, the feminist journal, has had for a very long time. And opens other possibilities for putting ideas together, a kind of theorizing in community rather than the individual as theorist in some ways.
Would you like to say something?
No, I can't really add much to that. Let's go on to the next.
Okay. I think the next, what I'd like to raise next is really connected to this, because, you've been using terms like polymorphality, intertextuality, and knowledge traveling. And I think what for me is so powerful about this book is its insistence on the fact that knowledge is always collective. There's a sociality of ideas which flies totally in the face of, elitist, patriarchal, Western-centric notions of the author or the definitive creator of knowledge. And it's so powerfully embedded not only in the content, but also in the form. So there's a politics to the form. Could you say something, do you have anything more that you want to say about the sociality, the collectivity of ideas, the kind of communal voice, or collective voice, I shouldn't say communal, because it's sometimes voices that are intention, but they are engaging, always.
Yes, that last one, that last thing you said is the magic for me. When something unpredictable or coincidental happens, in that process of creating knowledge. So, for example, my whole involvement in the conference was actually very coincidental. So for me to even be on site was coincidental. And then before anything got started, there were just a sequence of coincidence around who arrived on time, who was late, whose flight was cancelled, whose Zoom connection wasn't working, and like there's just so many variables that are utterly surprising. And so in this process of dialoguing with each other, or co-creating knowledge in the moment, what I found sort of theoretically most fascinating is that it was completely unpredictable what the product, so to speak, would be. But with the collective that I think you're speaking of, it wasn't just the collective in the room. It included the departed, because we were quoting a lot of people and thinking of them randomly, not by coincidence, but like that arrival of the idea that is stimulated by fellowship, by dialogue, by coincidental things like running into somebody on the way back from getting coffee, as you're going into a conference room. Or there's, for example, one panel that happened that wasn't in the program, and it happened to fill in for someone who couldn't be there, and then that ended up, we didn't come out of the room for 3 hours, and we're late for everything else, and so there was a lot of calling of ancestral collectives, and that's where the concept of the shrine endured, because there was something sacred about the sociality.
I'm so glad that you brought up the idea of the sacred, because I mean, for me, it's also connected to the metaphor of weaving and the kind of indescribably, I don't know, magical quality of certain forms of labor, gendered labor, that's disparaged. But one sees it's also in writing. And I'm thinking of I think everybody in this room knows the term intersectional. It is such a painful word. It is really, and I love, and that was part of our discussion yesterday, and I love the way that you frame a lot of the contributions, the conversations, and use also in your introduction the notion of weaving instead. Because weaving is sometimes messy, you sometimes get it wrong, goes in all sorts of weird places. So I don't know if you want to just pick up on that and your choice of the word weave. And also your feelings about it. I'm interested.
Okay, I'm going to take weaving, and Khadija can take on intersectionality.
Not the skirt.
Okay, so there's something about weaving that's funny enough came up. Where's Samantha from HSRC Press?
It's right there, it's weaving.
Oh. So weaving came afterwards, actually.
Yeah.
And it came afterwards in conversation.
Yes.
In conversation with HSRC Press. But actually the moment it was said, it was so clear to us. It made absolute sense, because we started with the notion of conversational bridges, right? And conversational bridges as a way in which you welcome people into a conversation, to a space of thinking. We get away from the sort of language of exclusion, the language of high academia, and we also acknowledge the fact that people are whole human beings. None of us walks into a place and said, oh, I'm not just going to be really smart and intellectual feminist, and I'm not going to be the feminist who goes and does something on the street or protests. I'm going to be so the idea of weaving then becomes very interesting, because you can't cut the various parts of your body, the various parts of your mind, your family history, your community history. You can't separate that out from the whole human being, right, that you are. And whether you acknowledge it or not, the interesting thing about the shrines is that we're in search of our shrines, and that the road to healing, I think, this is from Masvimte, I'm not going to be able to quote it entirely, but it's outside of the institution. And all too often the institution asks us to amputate these other parts of ourselves, right? So you're going to sit here and write beautiful feminist theory, but take your activism elsewhere, right? Your activism is out there somewhere, right? You might tick it off. And so what does it mean to weave, in a sense, that through and make it clear, right, how all those threads of who you are, the person you are, come together? And then more importantly, or perhaps not more importantly, but how does that then connect to others, right? So there's this sense where the performativity of having to defend the fact that you're clever. I'm clever and I can theorize and use big words, right? It sort of falls away, right? And it's a far more generative, productive, open way of saying, you know what? Some people would say to me, you know, I come to AFMs, I go to other conferences to do the paper that I'm going to present, and people are going to ask me clever questions, and I'll give them clever answers with long words. And then I come here to work through the stuff that I haven't managed to work through yet. I throw it into the room, and I have and through the other people in the room, I work through my ideas, and I come back. It feeds me and it sustains me for the rest of the academic year when I do other things, right? So that is, I suppose, the idea, a very multi-layered way of thinking of what is woven into this fabric, right? That becomes these conversational bridges. I'm like mixing metaphors like a crazy person.
No, but I love it. Do you want to respond? Would you like to say something?
To weaving, yeah, so the section on pedagogies was sort of my main task, and so weaving for that context then has to do with curriculum, or this idea of curating a path of learning, not just for the reader, but like you said, all of us, and it has to, it's an odd, yeah, you're trying to tangle or ravel something together that has a lot of different components, and then hopefully it can carry. It's something that can have capacity. So I also like the concept of weaving in that sense. Yeah.
Yeah.
I want to read. So this is on page 5. And this is to respond to intersectionality a little bit.
Oh, yeah.
And I'm going to throw big words. Thank you, Polo. So one of the critical arguments that this volume makes is that dialogue is an act of co-creating knowledge and solidarity. It is a habitation of a transversal dialogical epistemology that is grounded in the multiplicity of knowing and the right to speak from our varying historicities and studied pursuits. It is through conversation and dialogue that we come to know. Although there might be affinities and a conversation in common, very few of us will arrive or emerge with identical forms of knowing. Speaking, listening, and being responsive to one another is nonetheless how epistemic community is created. Drawing on Grosswick, O'Keefe states that the epistemic agency of individuals and the co-production of knowledge are critical to feminist epistemic communities. And so this idea of the emergent, the idea that we each come from particular kinds of histories, but when we come into conversation with each other, we are moved to become something else. And so very often the way intersectionality is used is as if we remain static and in one place. But what this collection shows us is that through conversation, through dialogue, through the co-creation of knowledge, we are moved to become otherwise. And what that otherwise is, we do not always know. And it is the contingent, it's the emergent, it's the unexpected, it's the surprise that allows us to be something a little more than what we were before, if the conversation takes hold in you. And in many ways, it's not just about talking to, because we all know we are in places where we talk a lot, but nothing really materializes sometimes. But it's in the ways in which particular kinds of conversations enable solidarities to emerge that have political potential and that have the potential to enact other forms of being in community. And I think a lot of the conversations in the volume do that. So it's intersectionality at work, and how intersectionality at work allows the enlargement of individuals' identities, but also the enlargement of a community that is in a process of making, and not in an idealized way, because I know I like to romanticize stuff. Because people also fight, and there are also people who fought and never ended up in the book, for example. So there's some things that never materialized and are in the absence in the book. And I think about that a lot as well. So.
I don't know if that's satisfying.
Yeah, no, as you're speaking, I'm thinking about how you're all raising the importance of the provisional, the contingent, the partial, the unfinished, and so on. And for me, this book is very much about theorizing and epistemology, and yet these are notions that are seen to be fixed and blunt, even on the left. Especially on the left. So, how do you understand theory? How do you understand epistemology? What for you was the working definition of theorizing and epistemological intervention that you, I mean, not to use big words, but I mean just in terms of what is it? You know, what is it in, you know, just a kind of a felt and spontaneous sense.
Yeah. Okay.
Did you ask?
She asked easy question. Do you want to stop? Okay. Knowledge production. So perhaps I can start with a story, because maybe this is a way for me to get into that. And I think this is a story that we use somewhere in the introduction when we think of the emergence of the term the feminist killjoy, right? And there's a story that's, again, contingent, but as we were putting together the introduction, I happened to come across Sarah Ahmed's blog. And it was just after Ama Aidu had passed, and the blog post was called Killjoy Debt, I think. Feminist Killjoy Debt. The title might be a little bit mangled right now. But in it, Ahmed thinks about how a few years earlier, before writing about the feminist killjoy, she'd been at a conference, or she'd been given a paper, and somebody in the room said to her, well, have you read Amata Aidu's sister, now I'm losing language, Amata Aidu, and have you read about, our sister Killjoy, right? And she hadn't, and went home. So this is contingent. Again, you're in a space, somebody mentions something, you go home, you look it up, you read it, you realize it's in conversation. It actually is reflecting in many ways some of your thinking, right? And then that becomes something else, right? You are moved by it, you're changed by it. You come up with this term that then circulates, right? Sarah Ahmed's a feminist killjoy. How many people who know that term can trace it back, right, to a Ghanaian author in a novel, right, about our sister killjoy? But there's this thing about the black-eyed squint in Ama Aidu's book, right? It's like the killjoy has this black-eyed squint and travels all around. Travels to Europe and back, being the killjoy, right? But I think that is the knowledge production that we're thinking of. The sort of thing that happens normally at around the water cooler, or in conferences when people go and get the coffee, and they've had ideas simmer, right? And then they have this conversation over coffee, and something comes up, something connects, right? So it's a sort of organic sense that I will not call undisciplined, but I'll call embodied, I'll call affective, I would call holistic. And I think it's changing our orientation to what it means to produce knowledge outside of institutionalized knowledge, and the so-called, and really questioning the very idea of this very formulaic way we think that of valorizing certain sorts of knowledge, right? That, I mean, for example, what I loved about Sophie's chapter is that towards the end of the conversation, she said, well, I didn't even know this word feminist, right? And then I came across it and I realized that's what I've been doing, right? So the idea that just because you do not mobilize certain registers, certain vocabulary, certain lexicon, certain structures, right? That cannot be this bounded idea of what knowledge is. So it's really a shifting of orientation.
Yeah, what she said.
Do you want to say something, Erica?
No, this is good. Yes.
Okay, maybe you want to say something now, because I'm curious about, at the same time that you're talking about including different voices and variety and scope, and Aika came in sort of incidentally and coincidentally, there were hard choices you had to make about what goes in and what goes out as editors. How were those choices made? What sort of how are those choices made? Let's leave it at that.
But I feel like I wasn't really part of making the choice, because during the conference I was not privy to all panels, for example, and Polo and Kanita have really been the main organizers, so I can't.
Okay, I'm really challenged now
Yeah,
and ask
yeah.
you, what would you have liked to see more? I mean, these are two South African editors. What would you have liked to see more?
Okay, so there was this moment where we called it Snapchat because we hadn't gotten used to the word QR code. and so we had this moment of fantasizing it, but actually it's theorizing that we did, because we were like, okay, how can we make this 21st century? Because all of us were born last century. And so we realized, wouldn't it be fun to, because there was so much we wanted to include but couldn't, wouldn't it be fun to have these QR codes somehow organized in the book, where if you want to have the citational map or more, or actually go to what couldn't make it into the volume, then you could do that. So that was, I remember we were really trying to cope with the experience of cutting out and excluding. For me personally, because I worked on the conversations about surfacing and wrote my story anyway. I was sort of also taking notes on how Barbara, in this case, sorry to out you now here, but the conversation itself was about how you did it in your book, or with Nadia and your conversation, for example. Like I was witnessing or was listening to you talk about how you have dealt with it in the past, and the same is true for Tiffany Willoughby's book. So I was sort of, again, I was more of an apprentice trying to take note of how, I mean, you talked about this with Habiba, how you also had, I think, 10 times more submissions than what you could actually print in surfacing. And yeah, so I was just listening to what that was about. I think one more element was maybe that there were some conversations where turning them into text almost did them a violence. And so those were some that we let go early because we knew we wouldn't be able to. So for example, that conference that happened by coincidence, like that panel that I got, walked into that lasted 3 hours, there's no way that could have been put into print because it involved, it involved just so many tangents, and then online, it was a hybrid conference, so the people from the US were chiming in, and yeah, so I remember that played a role in the selection. That was hard.
Do either of you want to choose?
So I would like. So there were two panel conversations that didn't make it into the book, and that was really due to time and trying to negotiate. And I would have loved to have seen them there. But in the larger scope of the book, the conversations and the panels sort of follow the trajectory and the growth of the conference. And I think there's a really great spread of Southern African thinkers in here, and in some thinkers from elsewhere. But I would have liked to have seen a lot, like if this were my ideal, if it were an ideal book, there'd be conversations with North African feminist scholars, there'd be conversations like, that's specific to West Africa, East Africa. And so I think a larger geographic spread would have been amazing. Then I would have loved to have seen a lot more art, and connections to other forms, multimedia forms of knowledge making. But I think it's a great idea for future books. But that's what I think, and I think it's even though there's this growing African feminist archive, it's one of the particular sort of is that even as there's a growth in the spread of epistemic community, there's there are a lot of silos, and there are lots of ways in which particular connections are not made, and I think that's something that would be thinking forward into the future, that's the kind of to get those African feminists who work through Codesria, for example, or through to make those kinds of connections would be fantastic.
Yeah, I'm going to echo what Carnita said, because right from the beginning we said, how do we force everybody into this language? We're using English when we recognize that so much of what is said and thought and lived is happening not just francophone, lusophone spaces, but happening in Swahili, happening in Zulu, happening in Sesotho. So there is a sense where there is mediation, where you have to understand that there are almost practical limits, and the limits are ourselves also, and what we're able to access. I think there was also an issue around what the recordings were looking like. One of the wonderful things about AFEMS has been that it's a self-archiving process. So the idea has been that every single year you record as much as possible, so that you can still go to an AFEM site and find presentations, conversations that have happened, right? So there's this sort of way in which it's very intentional in holding on to that. But the conversations we lost were environmental feminisms, which I think was amazing, but logistically just ended up not working. There was another one that in the transcript process on transnational feminists, where we were working with people who were in the UK and also located here. So some of those went away, we lost them. But we also expanded the idea of conversation, because my absolute favorite, okay, nobody should have favorites, but there's, you already said you have. Peace Igua's piece. Peace Igua is exceptional because it's a conversation with Mashilo Mutei, but not to Mashilo, because just thinking about how met her through her writing, met her through this chance encounter going to her house after a particularly traumatic experience, right? And so it's like this ode, this sort of, to like this person that, I met her physically, we didn't manage to have a conversation at the time. And then I went home and I got the books. And then I started reading Mashilo and found myself in conversation with her. So the very idea that they were using words is different. As a matter of fact, she went to Mashilo's house and fell asleep on the couch, and they didn't have a conversation. And then it becomes this other way, you know, of being in conversation with your words and your ideas. So even that, I think, again, we sort of expanded, or tried to at least, yeah.
Thanks. Okay. I'm going to end with one question which I think other people might want to pick up on. So I'm going to open it after my conversation to other people so that you can hold my hole, so to speak. And I have to also say that I have to leave exactly at 7. I hate doing this diva thing because other people do it, I think, oh please. But I have to do it today. I'm sorry. So the question that I have is, you've deliberately used African feminism. You've used an S. So I'm curious to have a sense of your understanding of what African feminism means today, your sense of the possibilities, in addition to what you've already said, the erasures and exclusions that it now addresses, and also its commodification in some ways at certain points, if you want to go there. So I'll stop there and then open it up. Or would you prefer to respond to this? Or should I take a round?
We have a lot of African feminism.
I think so. Yeah, so maybe a round of 2 more questions. Yvette, you want to have a question or an answer? A comment? No comments. No, Yvette. Just. Okay, but anyway, I think time for people to really, you know, with all due respect, Yvette, questions. Or
There's one there.
I'm not going to get down here. Somebody, please. Thank you.
Yeah, one can search.
She's got. She's got it. She's got a question.
Are they?
Thank you. Greetings. My name is Nompi Lonzogu, and I was privileged actually in undergrad to be a student at the AGI, and Amina and all of those guys, Jane when the AGI started out in the early 2000s at undergrad. So it's quite interesting to see how so many of those conversations have evolved over time, over the years, across different people. My 2 questions are quite simple. One, there are so many African feminist things happening all over, including, for example, the African Feminist Forum, which generally has such a wider geographical concept. So I really like this, but I agree that the absence is that it feels like it has a Southern Africanness of it, which is not a bad thing. But I do wonder what it looks like when African feminists start to collaborate better instead of all walking in parallel streams, all as African feminists, and what that makes it look like when Amina Okesha or somebody else from a different space is also part of the space, and just the synergies that can happen with that. So I love this, but I also want to see that African feminism of it, not the. Yeah, and then the second thing is related to Ika's very clever observation of snapshot versus QR codes. But just to say that there's a group of people that are safely saying, comfortably saying they're African feminists. But I do wonder what the next generation, what the intergenerationality of it is, and what that looks like.
Does anybody want to respond? I do another question.
Yeah.
Another
But I
question.
did want to respond.
Maybe there's another.
No, we can collect more questions.
For 8 minutes.
Oh, sorry.
She's
Yeah,
fine.
which, okay. Should I hold on to this one?
That's it.
I think.
I guess my question is, intersectionality is where it keeps coming up. Right? The question I'm looking at as a multimedia artist, I'm looking at how do you collaborate with QR codes and all of that. I'm really not about electronics, because when the lights go out and there's no electricity for anything, how do you address that? So what I like about South Africa is the fact that they are addressing solar power, right? And as we talk about the sun, the solar power, and the moon, right? Power. How do you address the ecosystem in the right?
Do you want to respond now, or do you want another question from? Can we do 3 questions and then we'll respond? Okay.
Yeah.
Although this is
Thank you so much. I wonder if you could talk a little bit, the editorial space means that you sit outside of the broader conversation. So can you say a little bit more about that introduction and conclusion for each chapter, and how you understand yourself theorizing with the conversation, or is there something else you're doing in that intro conclusion? Because it is something different to what happened in Athens, and there's time and space between what was being experimented with and what has to then stick on a page.
Does each of us take a question? Which one do you want to take?
You can decide whatever you want to.
Okay.
Whatever you want to.
Can I talk to African feminisms?
Yes.
You know, I have been traumatized by people who call themselves African feminists in some places, right?
Mm-hmm.
So yeah. so you know, none of this language. We try to be careful about languaging, right? But we also understand that what happens often is that the very language that we use, liberatory language for ourselves, the language that we use to express ourselves, so quickly can so quickly be appropriated, mobilized, deadened. And I'm not going to say policy is a bad thing, but can be flattened in ways that do not respond to the textures, right? To the textures and the layers, and I think I'm going to try and use the word haptic, right? And haptic as through and felt through the body and through the feet, through this sort of sense of lived, embodied, experienced, complex, contradictory, and not at all idealized, right? So there's a sense in which we're always in a progress of in a process of reaching out to each other. And I say that with the thinking about our histories as a continent, not just the languages that become these borders, right? That for some reason we, you know, how as a francophone feminist sitting in Dakar, how is it so difficult for me to have a conversation with a Lusophone feminist sitting in Maputo or somebody in Southern Africa? So I agree with you that there are these sort of parallel conversations happening, and that there is a sense in which we need to be reaching out to each other in terms of a network. But I also think that some of these spaces do different things, right? Some of the gatherings are very much about policy. Some of the gatherings are very much about specific interventions, right? And others are, you know, they each have their own character, right? They each have their own things that they generate as an energy. But it's not for that reason, because of that they should be siloed. I think the idea of the bridges is also an invitation for us to do the work of bridging, right? And not be comfortable saying, well, I'm an English speaker, so you know, what am I supposed to do, right? So to try and find those spaces and send those invitations. And what it meant for us, for example, is sometimes it's about money, because you go, I'd love to reach out, and do this, but what are the funds that are available for translation and interpreting? You don't want to bring people into a space and not be able to have them heard or understood properly, right? The idea of breaking out, and I'm focusing a lot on language because I think a lot of it does tend to become go along those lines, is what means do we have, what means do we give ourselves to create those bridges? And some of it is unfortunately around funding and the resources to produce that, right? And these are, again, it's not an excuse. I think it is a challenge, and it is an invocation of work that still needs to happen and will continue to be done. So that was my question.
Thank you. Khadija, do you want to go next, or I can?
Please go ahead.
Okay.
I think, I'll read 2 sentences that helped me answer maybe 2 of these. This is from the chapter on surfacing. I wrote the book up just now, I wrote it. So each one of our chapters has a way of branching out into multiple bibliographical pathways, contributing its own conceptual and citational maps, guiding scholars and teachers alike through the sometimes maze-like knowledge networks that have so painstakingly documented the survival of Black feminist discourse from Southern Africa. So this is just one of the places in the book where we try to position ourselves very articulately, that we were aware that we were speaking to Africa.
Yeah.
But then the second sentence, that survival is not an exaggerated term here if we think of the archive as a death sentence. To borrow Saidiya Hartman's analogy, an analogy that likens the archive to a tomb unless we manage to surface the voices and narratives that are drowning. So I think the QR code desperation came out of that particular moment of being so desperate to figure out how to make it truly polyvocal and have all the things that I can't say in English live either in audio or video or both. But now that you spoke, Polo, I actually, especially with this AI thing that also happened since we started working on this in the last, I don't know, it feels like 2 days ago for me. Now I just want to go back to the farm. Now I just want to put the effort into traveling and seeing people face to face. So yes, so to answer the question about the ecosystem, there was a despair around how do we create these maps and include everyone, even the ones who never wrote or never went to primary school to learn what we call literacy in a formal sense. And we dreamt of, okay, what kind of technology would we need to create that kind of book? And then we realized we thought we were a decade early kind of for that. But now that AI has actually created ways of almost simulating in 4D, you can simulate a lecture hall with Leanne's and Barbara's in it.
Yeah.
And I don't want that at all. So I'd rather go back to, can we meet in person and put the effort into seeing face to face, even if it will be fleeting and not recorded or published.
Thank you.
I think I'll respond to it. And so, unfortunately, so with the panel conversations, we'd asked the people who were discussants to write the intros and conclusions. So, so it was I think it was in one sense an attempt to contain what were very open conversations and to provide a kind of frame for that and to open up a potential, but also to contain at the same time. So I can speak to the 2 that I did. So the one conversation I was the discussant in, and then unfortunately and very sadly we lost Hazel Jojo during the process, although she was very young, she was a brilliant young African feminist, and she was the discussant in the Transfeminisms conversation. And we lost her, and so I ended up writing the intro and the conclusion. because it was in some senses a pragmatic choice, but also given the context of the loss. And so, so some of the containment and opening of the and openings that were made possible by not just putting transcripts down, you know, it allowed a particular kind of reading, I think, to emerge of the transcriptions of these panels, and in some senses, some of that, what we think of as conventional academic work, is, you know, that reading into the larger archive, bringing together contemporary debates with a conversation, and so doing that act of weaving, you know, that weaving between two kinds of languages and trying to hold to a language in common in some ways, and to show the connections between what we think of as the conventional theorizing, and how to read it in the conversations at times. And so that's sort of to weave together different ways of knowing, which is just, you know, the episteme.
Can I add to that in terms of curating? Because there's I just want to add that there's a curatorial part of this, right? In terms of the weaving, in terms of the framing that was being done, because part of the way that we have to weave the conversation as well is for us to write these section titles, right? We had to group the conversations together. Part 1, In Search of Our Shrines, and sort of think of what that means, group certain, you know, Part 2, Abundant Pedagogy. So beyond the critical framings, the introduction for each chapter, there's also the ways in which we are guiding a reader through the conversations, right? Abundant Pedagogies, which is Carnita, she was like, let's think of abundance. We're always thinking about, you know, absence and lack and scarcity and what we're lacking, but we actually have so much actually, and how do we capture that? And then the last ones is like solidarities as bridges, right? Not bridges of solidarity. Solidarity is bridges. So there's over and above the critical introductions and the conclusions and the sort of citational maps. Part of the scaffolding that we produce is also to think about our own curatorial practice and sort of how we weave. I'm going to use weave. We're all going to use weaving now. The conversations together, right? So there's a curation that's happening as well. That's critical. Yeah.
But I think that's a really important question, because it indicates that, you know, there's a slippery slope, fine dividing line between curating and gatekeeping. And, you know, as academics, working in a particular way, there's a sense in which you're shaping. But it always happens, and it's so interesting to be aware of that. So I think maybe another round of questions.
Barbara has a question.
I know that Yvette, your comment. Maybe we should go to Yvette first, but I have to know.
I know. Thank you so much to Desiree for chairing, and Desiree is rushing to another event where she's also chairing a panel, so we're very grateful that she came to us tonight. The WCJ Studies Department is hosting, so thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you.
We appreciate it so much.
Thank you, Des, and it was scintillating to be in a session facilitated by her. I just wanted to apologize on behalf of me and Pete, especially to Carnita, who brought together that FM's panel that showed the movie Loving Amidst the Climate Change. We had a beautiful discussion. Carnita made the transcripts, and all P and I had to do was to edit. And I especially want to apologize also to Michelle Crescent and Natasha Valley, dutifully transcribed their parts. But I mean, I think of my friend Kabima Badulu taught me the term post-concussive. Let me say I'm definitely post-concussive, and he's definitely So we're very careful about our public image and what we put into print and not. So I've humbly apologized, and I have to say that if it wasn't for disappointing old friends, I wouldn't have cared a toss, because naturally that absence made it possible to include some bright young feminists in the book. And I'm sure the book is better for it, because you know, what does post-concussive really teach? Maybe that your memory doesn't work. So I feel good about it. That's all I wanted to say. And I can, you know, if you weren't at the forefront experimenting, you wouldn't be questioned. Because let's face it, if you sat at home doing nothing, then nobody would question you. Well, maybe a few young people. But so don't worry about it, because that's how we learn. You know, we drive the theories to practice. So congratulations, all three of you. I'm so very, very proud of you. And it's not too late. As you know, P dug up the sources about Agent Orange in New Jersey, and I'm ready to write it up, so we might be in the next. You know, I say this because I was at that AFEMS conference with that moment when I said, you know what, you don't have to be super feminist, you don't have to do it all, just tell that effing story. And you were like, no, keep on going. And I was like, okay, don't listen to us old people, and well done, because otherwise nobody will be asking you any questions.
Thank you.
Hi, thank you. I'm not post-concussive, I'm post-menopausal. Sorry. I wanted to ask about form, and the form that you used and the forms you decided on in formulating the chapters. I just did a seminar where we read queer literature through the formal elements, and I wanted to ask about like the structuring of the chapters with the introduction and they're such beautiful bookends, and to me it feels like a form of feminist care. The chapter that's or our chapter, where Aika does this beautiful containing, and I wanted to ask about, as feminists, how do you work? How did you subvert form, in other words? I know you did that, and can you make it a little bit more visible? But are you thought through throwing out some of the formal elements that we would expect a peer-reviewed, edited collection to have, and introduce new forms?
Are you gonna?
I want to just first respond to it. There's no need to apologize.
Yes, please.
And you know, like I believe like life happens the way it should happen, and there's maybe an essay there that can go to Agenda of Feminist Africa.
Especially Hazel, put it into such perspective, because look, we're still alive and in reasonably working order, right? So there's always another book. Exactly.
And I will love you anyway. So no need to apologize. I don't know that I should be the person to talk about the subversion of form, because we know I go straight for an academic form sometimes. Yeah, over to you, Ponomoji.
So I dream of breaking academic form. It's like my, if I could find a way to break it completely, I would. But so there were a couple of things. First of all, the question was, how do you handle orality? How do you handle what is spoken in such a way, and this transition into writing in such a way that you can honor ways of speaking, right? But how do you then, so it was a balancing act between maintaining the flow of conversation, and what we decided to do is not do these big, dense paragraphs, particularly in the conversation part. Mm-hmm. You know, so the introductions were pretty much standard paragraph format, but the moment you got into the conversations, we almost wanted to write it, you know, the way you read a storybook? And you read a novel, and like the characters are like in quotation marks, and she said, he said, no, that sort of, so deliberately sort of cutting it in that particular way, making sure that you can almost and then we realized that there's that element. There's also the Coney, Benita, the reading group was a particular challenge because we had to write people talking about reading something that was written. So you couldn't understand what they were saying unless you had chunks of what they were reading. But then you couldn't reproduce full chunks of what they were reading because then it was like. So then we had to think about how do we play with italics, how do we move what they're reading to, I think we moved it to the right margin. How do we take smaller excerpts of what was being read and really focus on what had captured the conversation at that point, right? So that was a particular challenge. We had the challenge of peace in conversation with Mashilo, but it's a sort of metaphorical conversation or sort of. So then to sort of Tianzi's point, which is asking questions, how do I do this? So there was a series of questions that are part of it. So then we sort of produce almost like a poem. So it's different lines of like these questions that come up slowly, so that you can see that there's a progression to the sort of questioning that happens. And then with Sophie's chapter, it was very important not to sort of foreignize Afrikaans words. So don't italicize them. Don't mark them as foreign to, right? To the language, to the dominant language, right? How to bring that into and really pay attention to also the ways in which people speak, right? So there was always a balancing act, but of course we had to cut off filler sounds. People are like, well, really, yes, really, yes, really. So we had to also do some of that work. So because it still has to be legible, right? So I think all I can say is that each conversation produced its own challenge, and therefore each conversation needed a different sort of touch. I remember Pumla's chapter. Pumla can talk. She can talk.
Leaders there.
Yes. There you go. Yes. Right? And you guys were speaking in like chants, long, So we needed to break that up as well so that a reader can get a sense of a sort of the dynamism of it. So it's not a transcript. It is reworked text. You are not going to listen to a recording and find the exact same words. People have had a chance to go back to their words and think about them. A thing that came up during editing was black with a capital B or black with a small b, and the capitalization. When people speak, you don't know whether they're not saying caps B, So you have to go back to them and say, what are your politics, right, around that? And each chapter, people had a different politics, and we had to signal that we're not going to try and overwrite, right? People are grappling with language, and the moment you go from spoken to written, some choices have to be made. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you everybody for being here. Thank you.
And thanks for contributing.
And thank you to everybody who contributed to the book. The book is really a testament to you.
Yes.
So thank you.
A few bits and pieces from me quickly. Firstly, thanks so much to Shamiz and the whole HSRC Press team for organising tonight and working with us on it. Thanks as always to Spirit, our line sponsors. Thanks in absentia to Desiree for running a conversation.